Nós estamos aqui hoje em mais um Papo Fácil, uma ocasião bastante especial. Eu vou conversar com Arick Goomanovsky, ele é vice-presidente de inovação da Tenable. Arick, we will conduct this conversation in English. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
You are here in Brazil for a Gartner event, and I would like to thank you for this opportunity, and let's talk for many things about that.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure being here in Brazil. It's my first time in this beautiful country, and I'm feeling privileged being here these days at this conference and meeting these amazing people.
Great. You joined Tenable about 1 or 2 years.
Exactly 1 year, actually.
1 year, yes. But your role at this time, you are in charge of innovation in some special areas. Can you talk me a little bit more about your interesting areas, please?
Yes, absolutely. So I joined the Tenable a year ago through an acquisition that Tenable made of a company called Hermetic. Hermetic is a cloud security company. I was one of the founders of that company. So I joined Tenable a year ago and was part of the leading team of our cloud security offering until like a month or two ago, where I moved to a new role of being responsible for the entire technology innovation at Tenable across all the products. Today, again, I focus mostly on the two core areas where Tenable is making a lot of investment. The first area is obviously cloud security, because that's my expertise. But another area is what we call exposure management. Tenable has started shifting over the last few years from its original core expertise of vulnerability management into a broader category that is called exposure management. And the idea in exposure management is to bring together all the risks that the organizations might be facing, all the vulnerabilities, all the exposures, and to help customers understand what is the overarching risk that the organization is facing across all the steps, not only in the silo of vulnerability, but broadly. And Tenable is basically today the leader of the exposure management category. There are some other vendors obviously active in that space as well. It's a very active space with a lot of innovation, by the way. And we are leading this wave. And it's kind of the next generation of vulnerability management by and large.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to talk with Tenable many times, with Arthur that you just met a few minutes ago. And at this time, I will put a shortcut. I don't know which side it will appear, but to my previous Tenable conversations. But I think that cloud is a matter of your interest, and you are specializing in. Security and cloud. At the first, this would appear to be a conflicting matter. And now, what can you say about the security in cloud? I know best participation can do it.
Absolutely. So, first of all, we have to admit that we live in very exciting times. You know, the famous Chinese curse that you live in interesting times. So we do live in interesting times. There are very few moments in history where the world is making such a transition as happening now, when all the IT infrastructure is basically shifting from the traditional on-premise to a hybrid model. Nobody will, very few organizations will go totally cloud, but it's going to be a hybrid model. But a big chunk of infrastructure is actually moving to the cloud, right? And it was happening slowly over the teens, but since I think 2019, 2020, we see a major transition of organizations to the cloud. And this is huge, right? Because the way security should be done in the cloud is different. What people started doing in the beginning when, they were just familiarizing them with this new concept of cloud and infrastructure, they tried to take the same technologies that worked on-premise to the cloud. By the way, Tenable also did the same. What Tenable recommended its customers in the beginning was, okay, take the Tenable agent and deploy that on your machine in the cloud. Now, the concept of securing the cloud are not very different from the concept of securing on-premise infrastructure. You have to secure workloads. You have to secure identities, right? You have to secure your network. However, some things in the cloud are dramatically different. For example, you have ephemeral workloads. The whole idea of cloud infrastructure is to allow yourself scale up and down your environment very fast and do that in a cost-effective manner, right? So you don't have to invest in a lot of infrastructure. Now, think about workloads that are coming up and down for minutes, sometimes seconds. How do you scan those workloads? Are the same ways you scan those workloads on-premise where they were fixed workloads applied to the cloud? Not necessarily. Also, think about identity. On-premise, identity was the second, third, maybe fourth line of defense. In the cloud, it really becomes the first line of defense, right? Identity is a new perimeter. It's a major attack surface, and it's the first line of defense. A lot of use cases, think about segregation of environment, dev and prod. How would you do that on-premise? You would do that by segmenting your network, putting a firewall between those two environments. In the cloud, you do that by identities, right? So a lot of things that on-premise were done through other controls, in the cloud are done by identity. So you have to protect identity, and it's becoming more important. You have to protect your workloads, but you have to do it differently, right? That's why when you're taking a cloud-first approach to cloud infrastructure security, you have to bear those things in mind and do things differently. Another very important thing that happens in the cloud and did not happen on-premise is that a lot of information you can get directly from the cloud service providers' APIs. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, what have you, right? They all give you a lot of APIs, and from the same source, you can get information about workloads, identities, network, all of the above, right? On-premise, if you wanted to get, for example, in our exposure management technology, right? If we want to give a customer information about their network configurations, we have to integrate with firewalls. If we want to give information about workloads, we pull information from our Tenable Nessus agent. If we want to give information about identities, we have to integrate into Active Directory or Okta. In the cloud, you can get a lot of information from one source, and therefore it allows you to give an holistic view. We call this technology that gives that holistic view CNAPP, or a Cloud Native Application Protection. That's the term Gartner has coined for that specific set of technologies. And what's cool about CNAPP is that it gives you an holistic view of your entire technical stack. It's kind of the exposure management, but for a cloud, right? So it gives you information about network, identities, workloads, and it also allows you, if you do that smart, correlate information about networks and workloads and identities. For example, you can say, hey, I have this workload, it has a critical vulnerability. Interesting. But it's also exposed to the internet. So someone from the outside can actually talk to my workload and maybe, take control over that by leveraging that vulnerability. Furthermore, that workload is using an identity with sensitive permissions. So now the attacker can use this access to that endpoint and move laterally to more interesting information. So you're kind of connecting easily information about network misconfigurations, workload vulnerabilities, and identities and permissions into one single story, right? So you can talk about, instead of talking about exposures or vulnerabilities, you talk about attack scenarios, realistic attack scenarios that someone, a real threat actor, can leverage against your organization. And that allows you to prioritize easier because, in today's cloud environment, you can have millions of issues. You have to find that one that will drive the more value for your buck, right? So where you have to focus. And cloud allows you to do that.
Yeah. What you just said is so important because I know in the not so long, many companies use it to think that just to hire a cloud provider service, I'm safe, but it's not.
You're absolutely right. Cloud, security in the cloud is what we call a shared responsibility model. Some of the responsibility lies on the cloud service provider. For example, if they give you a machine, they're responsible for making sure that the operating system is updated, right? If they give you a managed database, they're responsible for running the database and making sure that the software that the database is using is patched, right? This is something that the cloud service provider is responsible for. But what comes on top of that is the responsibility of the data owner. So if I build my application and I write my code, it's my responsibility to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities in the code I run. If I'm running a Kubernetes cluster, it's my responsibility to make sure that it's properly configured. And obviously, if I'm using users and giving them permissions to access sensitive information, it's my responsibility to make sure that they have access to what they need and don't have access to what they don't need.
Yeah. Well, just to finish our conversation, our time is short, but it's a It's a privilege, as I said, to be here with you. I know Tenable had disclosed a study recently about security in cloud, something like this. Can you please briefly talk about this study, because there are many important conclusions?
Absolutely. So one of the interesting conclusions, as I said, how do you combine insights from different areas of your cloud infrastructure into meaningful stories? For example, if you look in silos, you look at vulnerabilities, we discovered that it takes people many, many months on average to patch even the most critical vulnerabilities. Because we have presence in so many organizations, for example, we can track a vulnerability, we can see how many organizations have that vulnerability over time, and we see that it takes people months. We know how many Kubernetes clusters are exposed to the internet. We know that there are 50% maybe of Kubernetes clusters expose their configuration API directly to the internet, so anyone can talk to them. We know that the vast majority of identities that are used are over-permissive. And moreover, we know that probably 80% of organizations have realistic attack scenarios that combine all these elements together into real threat against their organizations. And that's why I think people should start moving towards using not silo technologies, but CNAPP platforms or exposure management platforms that really give them this holistic view of the risk and how they can best work in order to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, those information is so important. All the people must be aware of that, because may change the way they will decide where they will distribute their workloads and how to make them safe.
Correct, absolutely.
Great. Aaron, it's very nice to be here. I hope you enjoy all your stay here in Brazil and your first time. São Paulo is not really a sightseeing city, but you like it. They're a good place to know. And I hope the conference, you have the presentation tomorrow.
Correct.
I hope you have a very nice presentation. Maybe in a near future, we can have another conversation.
Absolutely. Looking forward to this. And thank you so much for having me in this beautiful city and beautiful country.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Este foi mais um Papo Fácil aqui com Arick Goomanovsky, vice-presidente de inovação da Tenable. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
I hope to have a conversation with you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.